There's power in the factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in a union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. Mistakes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to trenches full of mud. War has always been the bosses' way. So
I would like to thank you for joining us today as we celebrate the launch of City on Strike by Harriet Sansom. Here to introduce Harriet, I would like to call up your host for this afternoon. Terry McLeod is an independent Emmy-nominated journalist, Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal recipient, and former CBC radio and TV host, presenter, and producer. Please join me in welcoming Terry McLeod.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, all of you, way to the back of the room for coming out this afternoon. We're so glad you're here. I should ask, how many of you here are related to Harriet? How many of you worked with Harriet? That pretty much covers the entire room. So I've been reading the book. I've read it 3 times, and because I like it more every time I read it. Harriet, thanks a lot for getting me to be part of this.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's very
well
history, and I realize I do know this topic quite well because my family is an immigrant family. I only know a smattering of what happened during the strike, very tiny amounts, but it's the whole sense of the experience of being an immigrant family in the time when, in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s. I think of things in terms of grade 5, 6, or 7, 8 kind of thing. I think in terms of children's books, and there's nothing like reaching a child through a story, and if you tell it through if they identify with it, then it teaches them a lot. You teach them empathy that will last a lifetime. I felt that way as a child, and I saw that in the students I taught, how it opened their eyes to history. Yeah.
You know what it reminded me of? Anne of Green Gables.
Is that right?
I mean, it was a book in a sense that was written with a young protagonist from a child's point of view, but it had so much depth, and this book has so much depth as the world seen through the eyes of these children and through their emotional responses, through their aspirations.
Well, that children's writing brings the important issues of society through a child's view, but a child experiences those things. They might see it through a slightly different lens as they are coming to understand it and interact with people who are affected by it. But you need to have those issues in those books, and that is a good story is a good story.
Your parents were both born in what, 1922?
Yeah.
Here? In what way is your family history reflected in the story?
Oh, there's a ton of little stories that are in there.
There are a lot of name details as well. Tell us some of the names that come out of your world that now are inhabited by the characters in the book.
Okay, so Nellie was my mother. Jack is my uncle, my father's brother. He's in California. He agreed that I could use his name. Mr. Quirk, who runs the delicatessen, is he died in 1929. He would have been my great uncle, but he was a young man, and he just dropped dead apparently one day in his grocery store. And I thought, well, here, poor Mr. Quirk isn't remembered, so I thought I'd put him in. There's everybody, well, every character has a tag in somewhere in my life, except for 2 bad actors. Walter was just a name I grabbed, and the principal, who was someone whose name I took from a picture book character, a cat who thought he could outsmart a mouse.
Fanny Sidner worked as a hello girl, is that right?
Right.
Yeah. But she didn't use her name when she worked for the phone company.
No.
She changed it.
Yeah.
Why was that?
Because people did change their names to get better jobs. You could not get a job. people didn't hire you, certain employers didn't hire you if you were Ukrainian or Jewish or whatever. And so people did change their names so that they could, so they didn't have to toil at the worst possible jobs.
And then Louis Foote appears at a central part of the story, and we know the photos. If you've ever seen the photos from the general strike, it was Foote who really cataloged the whole thing for us. What role does he play in the story?
Well, he sees the strike through his lens, and he captures it through his lenses, and he teaches Jack how to look at the world through a different kind of lens. So Jack has his initial way of seeing things, and by teaching Jack to use a camera, there's a leap that Jack makes in terms of looking at other people, especially William, who's from the other side of the river. Funny, my grandmother lived on Flora and Andrews until I was 15, and we played there when we were kids or whatever like this. And I'm writing the book, and I'm writing, and Andrews, and I realized as a teacher librarian, one of the books we had in our school was a book of the names of streets in Winnipeg, and I used to once in a while flip through it, and I thought, oh my goodness, I better check that. So I did, and I realized it's named after A.J. Andrews, who was the mayor in 1897 to 98, I think, and they named the street after him, and he was the lead actor in the Committee of 1,000, working to suppress the strike. But there they were, living on the street where I played, where my family lived. Actually, in the previous year, there had been 150,000 people across Canada involved in about 500 strikes. And so prices had been going up about 65% during the war years, but wages had been frozen at 1914 levels. And they were very low wages to begin with. And now they'd taken lessons from San Diego, where there had been a very, very violent suppression of a strike in 1912. In 1919, just a few months earlier in Seattle, 60,000 people had gone on strike for a week, and it was crushed. And they had workshops from some employers group from Minneapolis who came up here to give them lessons in what to do on how to crush a strike. So they were getting organized, and they decided to call themselves the Committee of 1,000 after the committee in San Diego, just to inflate their name.
They never had talked about a passage that you were going to read for us?
Yes, small. Many mornings, Fanny had gone out to protest, almost as if she were going to work. She'd taken part in women's demonstrations in front of the T. Eaton Company, the largest department store in the city. Everyone shopped there. They sold everything from clothes to houses. Eaton's opposed the strike, promising to fire any employees who took part. But Eaton's didn't account for Helen Armstrong, Fanny told them when she came home one evening. She is a determined woman. Helen Armstrong was one of the strike leaders. In a matter of days after the strike began, she organized a free soup kitchen called the Labor Cafe for single women who had walked off the job. When Eaton's had threatened their employees, Helen Armstrong and other women, including Fanny, had gathered outside the store on Portage Avenue, urging the low-paid saleswomen arriving for work to join their ranks. Fanny spoke to one of the saleswomen who walked past toward the entrance of the store. She stopped, then turned around and approached the line. "I'm with you," she said. "I've had it. The managers tell us not to eat a lot, so we'll be as skinny as possible." She slipped her arms in with those of the other strikers. "If they fire me," she laughed, "I'll be poor, but at least I'll be able to breathe." Her new sisters clapped and cheered for her. The company declared its support for the Citizens Committee of 1,000 and fired any of their workers who joined the strike. Eaton's also announced it would send out the company's famous horse-drawn rigs to make deliveries around the city. They would carry on business as usual. Strikers learned that Eaton's would be delivering orders to households in the west end of the city. They planned a blockade. That's when Fanny proposed an idea to Mama. "Come with me, Mama. You're part of the strike too," she said. "Ich kann nicht. I can't," Mama said, shaking her head. "Es ist so weit. It's so far away." "Mama," Fanny said, "that's an excuse. It's only a 30-minute walk." When they came home later that day, Nellie was astonished to see how her mother acted. She was like a different person, as if she didn't have a care in the world. Mama ignored Nellie's repeated questions about what had happened until they sat down to dinner, and at last Fanny filled her in. Mama, Fanny, and a few hundred other women had converged at Logan Avenue and McPhillip Street to stop Eaton's from making deliveries to its warehouse. Wasn't it dangerous when the horses came close, Nellie asked. Yes, but we all linked arms, Fanny said. She described the way the women began shouting and screaming, frightening the animals. The drivers yelled at the women, "Move away!" and swung their fists in the air. But we women, German, Irish, Italian, Polish, Jewish, Ukrainian, and British, all of us refused to move. We swung our fists right back. You should have seen Mama. Tell them what you shouted at the drivers, Mama, Fanny said, a smile curling on her lips. Mama quickly began studying her soup. Hab gar nicht gesagt, she said. I didn't say anything. Mama, Fanny chided, elbowing her mother playfully. Tell them. Mama clucked her tongue. I said, Wachsen sollst du wie ein Sibylle mit dem Kopf in Drerd. May you grow like an onion with your head in the ground. She chuckled. They don't understand Yiddish, but they understood my fist. She raised her fist and showed her family how she shook it. Mama, Nellie exclaimed. She had never heard her mother say a nasty word, and certainly never saw her raise her fist in anger. It wasn't only me, Mama said, feigning innocence. Mary Danchuk next door came too, and she told them in Ukrainian, "Abetebe kachka kapnula." May a duck kick you. And she swung both fists. Nellie and Jack burst out laughing. Their neighbor was a quiet woman who liked to garden. They couldn't imagine her on a picket line cursing. Mrs. Minarski swore at them in Polish, Fanny said. Vipek shisyanem, stuff yourself with hay. Tata and Mama laughed. And the drivers turned the horses around, Fanny went on. The mighty Eaton's department store was defeated by a bunch of women. They all laughed harder. Mama talked about the women who had been friendly to her. Nellie made Mama show her again how she had raised her fist.
Looking more seriously, though, at the strike, the intensity of the establishment opposing the strike got very extreme, and it's clear in the book. There's certain parts of it that are difficult to read because of the intensity of what people are exposed to, and the threats, and the clubs, and the horses running over people, and all that kind of stuff. How did you balance figuring out what to say about that, particularly for a younger readership?
Well, you know, actually, it was really hard. I found that a hard part to write because it happened. It happened. That's what's so upsetting about it. It's not fiction. I tried to make them understand the fear that people felt. It was a very vicious event. It was the full force of the commercial world, the political world, and the state all converging to make sure that people were put in their place. Winnipeg was the third largest city in Canada, and they were deathly afraid that anything, if they didn't crush this, or that people would make demands. That people would make demands for better wages and working conditions. So they spread these red herrings about children dying for lack of milk, which didn't happen at all. There were Bolsheviks from New York who'd come here to foment revolution. That all the strike committee was full of aliens when they were all actually British born or British originated. They used the newspapers, they used all the media they could in order to sow confusion in people's minds, people who, not only the larger public who were not necessarily engaged in the strike, but had a stake in it if things improved, but also among the strikers, and to get people fighting amongst and to avoid the real issues.
I notice you avoided using the term fake news.
Well, it was completely fake. It was completely fake news. In terms of, in Winnipeg in 1919, 3% of the people were native Winnipeggers. 3% of the people had been born here. Everyone else was an immigrant. And of the people who had come here, about 10 or 12% came from Ontario, and the Anglo-British elite, or whatever you want to call them, they came from Ontario. They were a more experienced group. They had a background here, family background, going back a generation or two or whatever, depending on when their family came. They had more money. They had experience living in Canada, and they established themselves, and they were going to maintain the society that they came from, and they were quite happy to have the foreigners, the aliens, do their housework or work in their factories, but as long as they came to their place. The war was an enormously profitable time in terms of industry and manufacturing, and in terms of real estate. In terms of selling land and building, they made huge profits, and that's what they were out to maintain. So
there's some fantastic detail in the book, some funny detail. We learn all about antimacassars.
Yeah.
So you know what antimacassars
I'm not the only one who knows.
So you do. They were.
Those are the fun things. You learn all sorts of obscure details about when you do that research. I mean, I actually did know what an antimacassar was before.
And tell us about that incredible storm that happened.
There were 135-kilometer-an-hour winds that hit that night, and the houses were wrecked. Their roofs were ripped off. Their verandas were shredded. There was debris all over the streets. It was just fantastic. So it must have been a very, very damaging experience for the people. Their strike was going nowhere. The Committee of 1000 would not negotiate at all. People were running out of money. Food was running out in stores, and they had this destruction to their houses. But such was the Committee of 1000 that they had been putting out in their newspaper, the Citizen, that children were dying for lack of milk, and all this. That when some workers went to the Children's Hospital, which was on Aberdeen in the North End at the time, the roof was ripped off, and they offered to help fix it. They were turned away because they were strikers.
The poem that Jack recites, the Henley poem,
Invictus.
Invictus. How does that go? I am the master of my fate.
I'm the captain of my soul, right? I'm the captain of my master of fate. So this is a really inspiring poem, and Jack is learning it from Miss Ross, the teacher, and he likes the poem. But he says to L.B. Foote, he says, who is trying to encourage him, he says, yes, but I'm the object of discrimination just by virtue of the family I was born into. Can I actually accomplish my goals? And that's where things like, it just strikes you that no, a lot of people, including my family and many people whose families are represented here, could not accomplish their goals if they wanted further education or had certain objectives in life, because they were discriminated against, because their families are so little. They had to quit school, go out to work early, and their lives took a different trajectory because they just didn't allow them that way. So the strike committee didn't have the force of the state behind it. They unleashed the state against, and they were patrolling the streets with the militia.
Well, they had vehicles with machine guns mounted on the back.
Yeah. They planned it all. I was reading the newspapers, the Manitoba Free Press, and I'm reading the newspaper, I'm reading articles, and at the bottom, they used to have these little inserts at the bottom, little pieces of information. It said, in bold type even, that such and such, so many jeeps and machine guns had arrived in Winnipeg that day, in that sense.
And at the time of the strike, there were strikes of sympathy across North America.
Yeah, all across North America. Brandon walked out, I think it was in Calgary, Toronto. There were sympathy strikes all over the place. The world was looking at Winnipeg. They sent reporters from all over North America here, and it was the third largest city, and so that was pretty important. If you have, proportionally, it was about a third of the city going on strike. That's pretty darn big. So if you had that in other cities, you would have had big trouble. And to me, it was like reading or thinking about what immigrants today experience, and especially in the heated situation now with white supremacy and all sorts of anti-Muslim, anti-this, anti-that, anti-Semitism of the old sort has raised its head again. It's just horrible. And who benefits by it?
But I want to remind you that there's going to be a teacher's guide of the book available for Red Deer Press, right? Mm-hmm. And that also you are prepared to go into schools and talk about the book and to explain to students and meet with teachers to give them a better sense of the complexity of the book and the meaning of it. Yes, I'm about this, but is there something that you wanted to say that I haven't asked?
Well, I hope that the book honors the history of mine and many people's ancestors, the people who came here to work hard and to do good things for their family and to contribute to society. So I hope it does reflect that wish, and I hope that in terms of history, that it's a lesson that the lessons from that can, especially teachers and in families, but especially teachers can use this to teach about the issues of racism and unwarranted prejudices and being towards others, and the issue of being critical thinkers. Critical thinkers. Who benefits by this? Who benefits by this? Where does this come from? Does this make any sense? But I had a lot of help with, there's 5 kids here who helped bake, as well as some other individuals, and so I'd like to thank them all. But we have some, the North End Nosh, all available to you, and the kids are going to walk around with baskets of goodies, so that you don't all have to hit the table at the same time. So they'll be offering you things, but please eat.
Harriet, thank you so much for what you've done.
Well, thank you, Terry.
There's power in a factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in a union. Now the lessons of the past were all learned with workers' blood. Mistakes of the bosses we must pay for. From the cities and the farmlands to trenches full of mud, war has always been the boss's way, sir. The union forever defending our rights. Down with the black label workers unite. With our brothers and our sisters from many far-off lands. There is power in a union. Now I long for the morning that they realise brutality and unjust laws cannot defeat us. But who'll defend the workers who cannot organise when the bosses send their lackeys out to cheat us? Money speaks for money, the devil for his own. Who comes to speak for the skin and the bone? What a comfort to the widow, a light to the child. There is power in a union. The union forever defending our rights. Down with the black metal workers unite. With our brothers and our sisters together.